Hello, everyone. This is Dan Liebenson. We are here for another episode of Judaism Unbound recording live. This episode will be released most likely this coming Friday. So this is actually a faster turnaround than others. I do want to note for folks who are out there watching that we are continuing to work on some episodes that relate to our current situation that we're facing. And some of the challenges of that is that all the folks that we want to interview are busy on the barricades. So we will talk to them very, very shortly. So here we go with this formal recording of this episode, which is going to be an amazing one. So here we go. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 226. This is Judaism Unbound. Sorry, I'm getting a mic issue. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 226, Resting the Land. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here today for another live recording of Judaism Unbound. Today, our guest is Nati Passow. Hold on. I really need this. I guess I do a lot of P sounds. Today we are here for a conversation about the continuing. Today we're here for a conversation with Nati Passow. He is an assistant professor of sustainable food systems at Temple University and co-founder and former executive director of the Jewish Farm School of blessed memory. And we're excited to talk today about the whole world of Jewish farming and what that's all about. In addition, the Jewish Farm School, which was in operation for quite a few years, has recently shut down and gone into perhaps some kind of rest, some kind of period of non-operation. And maybe that's permanent and maybe it's not. That's some of what we might talk about today. But it's very interesting that it perhaps tracks some of the cycles of the farming world, of the land, that also Jewish organizations may be subject to some of the same forces. And that's something that we really want to talk about. We started to think about having this conversation with Nati some months ago when we started talking about the idea of Jewish organizations that were no longer around, and the question of whether the funding world may have as a goal some notion that organizations, once they're founded, ought to survive forever. Otherwise, there's some kind of problem. They're not worth funding. We took exception with that, and we said, no, we actually think that there's this idea that maybe, well, we took exception with that, and we thought that maybe it's more accurate to say that organizations like people should be around for a while, and their legacy is not in whether they live forever, but what's the impact that they've had while they were around, and specifically the idea that maybe one of their children grows up and does the next thing. And so these are all questions that we want to talk to Nati about. But the other thing that urged us to have this conversation right now was that Nati got in touch with us to talk about our conversation with Amichai Lau-Levi that we had just around Passover time, and where we were talking about this idea that we've just experienced an exodus due to the coronavirus, that we're now in this very strange new situation and we're really struggling to handle it. And Nati got in touch with us to talk about basically why we weren't ready for this, why we weren't better ready for this, given the Jewish history of such disruptions. So we're excited to have all of those conversations with you, Nati, and I want to welcome you to Judaism Unbound. So Nati Passow, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed listening to many of your episodes over the years.
Well, we're really excited. Well, we're always really excited to have a listener on as a guest, and more of that. So can we start by talking a little bit about what it was that you were thinking when you first got in touch with us after that conversation that we had with Amichai Lau-Levi?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in a way, this is something I've been thinking about for a while, kind of working in the environmental space and thinking a lot about climate change and adaptation and ways that the world as we know it may be disrupted, and how we can be prepared for that and adapt for that. I'm also the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and my mom was born in a displaced persons camp over in Austria and came over here when she was 2, and she's done a lot of Holocaust education over the years. So as someone who had kind of been brought up in that context and heard their stories and went through Jewish day school and a lot of different types of Holocaust education, I found myself feeling frustrated that it all felt very kind of like emotional and intellectual, but not very practical. When kind of meanwhile, my grandparents, some of the ways they survived literally were because they were able to do things with their hands. They were able to think in very practical terms. And in fact, both of my siblings are rabbis. And when at one point after college, I was doing carpentry full time. My grandfather was very excited. He said, finally, someone in the family who knows how to do something. And so it's something it's been an idea that's been percolating, and part of my motivation behind Jewish Farm School was around that. And but when this moment kind of hit, I found myself even being someone who has kind of thought about various scenarios and what might play out. I found myself in some ways less prepared than I would have hoped. And I really appreciated what Amichai was saying about kind of the mythologies, the stories, the rituals in Judaism that can help us navigate this on a spiritual level, or kind of draw comfort or learn lessons from these stories from our ancestors. But I felt a little bit stuck or a little frozen in, how do we make decisions as we're navigating completely new territory? How do we know who to trust? What are some like basic practices that we should just have? Like, should I already have had like a little stash of food and water in the basement going, or do I need to wait until there was a mad rush going on? So those types of lessons that I kind of felt like, how is this not like more deeply embedded in like the DNA of Jews? And how is this not something that gets kind of passed down from generation to generation? And listening to that, I said, I'm going to reach out and see what you all thought about that after that conversation with Amichai.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that you actually said right before we went live, because I think it's relevant to this. And we were talking to you a little bit about this idea of the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year. And Lex said something about how that's coming up in a year, and he's really excited to start talking about it. And you said, well, the best time to prepare for the sabbatical year is 5 years ago, or something along those lines. And I'm thinking about the question of when we have these kind of memories, whether they're historical or mythological, it just seems like it's human nature to start working on them closer to the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if we actually don't have the tools, or we've forgotten the tools, or somehow one of the most important tools was either forgotten or never passed along, which is some version of always be ready. I mean, the way that I'm thinking about it in terms of the cycles is that B'nai Lappi and I have been talking about recently this idea that we have various cycles in the Jewish year. We have Shabbat every week because maybe we need a weekly reminder to rest. We have a holiday, let's say once a year, of Yom Kippur. We need to remember to atone in a significant way once a year. We have the sabbatical year every 7 years for the land. We have the Jubilee every 50 years. Maybe we should be taking that more seriously in terms of economic reorientation and justice. And that has sort of been forgotten altogether. That could be a whole nother conversation that we should have. But then we have this 1,000 or 2,000 year tradition of major disruption in the very nature of Jewish life itself. And that's actually part of the tradition, and we should see it as such. And yet it always seems like when it comes, it's coming at us in a surprising and sudden way. And is it, on the one hand, it makes sense because that happens only so rarely. But on the other hand, like you say, we have this long history of it happening over and over, and maybe actually more often than every 1,000 years, depending on how you describe what we're talking about. But why is it that we're kind of not always ready?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the analogies that I've drawn when teaching about Shemitah is that in Hebrew, the days of the week are Yom Rishon, the first day, Li Shabbat, to Shabbat. Yom Sheni, the second day, to Shabbat. In other words, each day stands in relationship to Shabbat. And there are some people who have a practice of every day of the week, they do something to prepare for Shabbat. It might be they're making their shopping list, they're inviting their friends, as you get closer, they're doing some cooking and cleaning and whatever. So we have that model, right? Where actually we should have Shabbat consciousness every single day of the week. And at the same time, growing up in a traditional home where Shabbat started at a very specific time, and in the winter, that's pretty early, our house was always like a mad rush on Friday afternoons, right? And in fact, I think in this was many years ago that I read this, but in Zalman's Shafter Shalomi's book, Paradigm Shift, he encourages people who are first getting into a Shabbat practice to specifically have there be a mad rush to the last minute and then have that form a clean break, right? That contrast is one of the most important medicines of Shabbat. So on, kind of our tradition, or at least our community, represents two different models in this. I think that one of the things about Shemitah, the practice of the sabbatical year, we have not kept it in any real sense in thousands of years, right? Even the way that it's adhered to in modern Israel is one that allows the economy and agriculture to function more or less in similar ways, right? There's some loopholes, there's some technicalities, more food gets imported, there's some workarounds. But if you're just an average person who's not engaged in farming, living in Israel during a Shemitah year, you'll go to the market and there'll be more signs up, but you'll be able to get all the same stuff. Things won't look and feel different. So it's hard for us to like conceptualize what this might actually look like in a modern economy, in a global economy. But that said, if you really look at the practices of it, what are you going to be eating in a sabbatical year if you refrain from farming? Well, a big thing is perennials, fruit and nuts and berries. Well, we also have a law that says when you plant fruit trees, you have to wait 3 years before you can eat from them, right? So that already sets you back a few years. If you want to have food to eat, you got to start planting stuff in the first, second, and third year of the cycle. So the communal organizational systems that would be required to store surplus in the years leading up to the Shemitah and then distribute it in an equitable way, all of that takes in a tremendous amount of planning. And I think what's hard for people to wrap their heads around right now is they might imagine the Shemitah years like you have 6 years that look like the world we live in now, and then 1 year that's radically different. Well, it doesn't work that way, at least not with this particular practice. If you're not actually designing your whole system around this, it's not going to work, right? You decide on 4:30 on a Friday afternoon to keep Shabbos, and you've never done that before. Like, technically, you might be able to make it through Shabbat, but it's not going to be nearly as enjoyable as if you had put the intention in and taken the steps to prepare.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I think that there's something here where I don't think that the two pieces of people today struggling and waiting to the last minute for stuff, I think that's actually deeply tied to the fact that we aren't agriculturally minded, oriented people for the most part. I think those two threads might feel separate, but like when you live your life, and look, I haven't done this. I've never been somebody who farmed regularly, but like when you live your life and you invest effort and work into something, and literally nothing happens for the first while, but in a long time, like in months, something comes of that. Like, I mean, even just like even just having one house plant, right, in your house and like watching how it goes, starts small, gets big, and it takes a really long time. I mean, there's like the exercise at school where you have a little plot of earth. Like, I think something changes about you when you recognize sort of that long-term kind of thinking. And I'll be the first to admit that like I have a deficiency in that vitamin. Like I don't think, or maybe like that muscle of mine isn't one that I flex very much or exercise very much. Like I actually can't think of very many things in my life that I am putting effort in where the fruits of that effort won't come for like many months or years. My best thought is like I'm in rabbinical school, and that's been a many years process. And so like when that's done, there will be this huge sense of like, wow, there were many years into that. But the one, like I think in general, we need to take that teaching you're giving about Shabbat, about how each day of the week we could be sort of preparing for it. I think we need to generalize that much more, because the holidays where that does happen, I didn't grow up in a family that like cleaned the whole house for Passover, but like there are lots of families who, like, in order to do Passover in a certain way, you actually have to start a bunch early in order to not have any of the foods you're not allowed to have in the house. And so like I remember the first time I was at somebody's house, and it was like 3 weeks before Passover. Like I wasn't thinking about Passover at all, but they were already in the process of shifting what their house would be. And that altered me in a certain level. So I guess what I would ask about that is like, what does agriculture, like, what does it do to a person or to a community to be in that more long-term kind of mindset? Like, how would we all change? And like, I think there's an obvious answer around climate change, right? Like if we were thinking about this, we would notice that we're killing the world. But like, even to use your language, like more practically, what actually shifts about a person when we adopt more of a long-term mindset around agriculture or life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that that my friends who have been farmers for year after year, it's this balance of kind of every day there's a sense of urgency. There's so much to do, and like you're saying, there's like patience is built into the process, because if you're not patient, it's going to be incredibly frustrating. You know, you have to wait many months for your harvest. But I'd invite us to kind of actually think back to the ancestors, our ancestors. I'd invite us to think back to our ancestors who were farmers living in the land of the ancient land of Israel. And it's not just about preparing for Pesach a month leading up to it, preparing for Passover a month leading up to it. You're actually starting at the fall holiday of Sukkot. That is the time of year where you're planting your winter grains. So you're planting barley and wheat. And what do we do at the end of Sukkot? We begin praying for rain, right? Then you have the rainy season, and the first harvest of that is the barley harvest that starts at around Passover. And the second major harvest is the wheat harvest that you harvest at around Shavuot. So on a very literal agricultural level, right? You literally reap what you sow. Coming out of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the high holidays, a time of deep personal reflection and communal reflection, you're kind of setting your intentions for the year. You embody those intentions in the act of planting seeds. You turn to the heavens and begin praying. And then you see what happens at the other holidays. So the holidays become intrinsically connected on a very physical and real level. And that also kind of lends to this mentality of wanting to be prepared emotionally and spiritually, not just physically. But I think, I think you're right. I think that you know, the nature of our world right now is very fast paced, and it's hard to think about plans and tasks and ideas that need to happen many months in advance when we're just get so caught up in the fast pacedness of every day. And in my mind, that's, Shabbat, I think, is one of the most powerful tools in our society right now to curb that to some extent. And then if we kind of take the lessons and practices of Shemitah more literally and more seriously, then Shemitah becomes something that happens on, the next sphere of scale of time. And then Yovel, the Jubilee year that Dan mentioned, is a kind of like a once in a lifetime. After 7 cycles of 7 years, in this 50th year, we have this kind of pinnacle of communal experience. And I guess I'll add one thing about Yovel, about the Jubilee right now, because it's resonating with me in this moment, not just the pandemic, but also the Black Lives Matter protests around the country, and some of the changes we're already starting to see those some of the changes we're seeing those protests influence, is that our society is a society that has not experienced any true Yovel ever. Yovel being this giant economic reset button. The practices of the Yovel is that in the sabbatical year, all private agricultural lands become commons. They're shared by everyone. Anyone can access anyone's land. In the 50th year, all land returns to its ancestral origin, right? So as the Israelites conquered the land and it was divided up and tribes were given land and then it was divided up by family, the theory is, I think it's unclear if this was ever fully practiced, is that for 49 years, that land can get bought and sold and traded, and some people accumulate more wealth and some people are struggling in poverty. And in the 50th year, all that land gets redistributed back to the family that originally inhabited it. And to me, I think of that as primarily like a giant reset button, right? We're gonna let the economy play out, with guidelines and already redistribution of wealth built into the economic system and the agricultural system, but we're not gonna have such a heavy hand. But then once in a person's lifetime, we're gonna actually reset, because my kind of theory about all of this is that we are engaged in a millennia-old live action role play, and the rules and the guidelines that we have from the Torah and from the oral tradition are there to make sure that this live action role play can keep going indefinitely. And what we see is when there is no mechanism for reset, for economic reset, then disparities of wealth grow to a point that leads to often some sort of violent uprising, and the reset happens. It just happens in bloodier ways. We see this in ancient times, we see this in modern times. And both the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, I think, are there to provide that pressure release valve on a schedule where people know it's coming, and it allows that pressure to diffuse, hopefully in peaceful ways.
Nazi, before I ask my question, there's something that might be like scratching against your shirt. I don't know if it's where your mic is or.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so. It's just
Okay,
like when you kind of move around it. It's not terrible, but just took this opportunity to point it out.
No problem. Yeah, my mic is sitting on my shirt, so
I can't see because it's a black shirt.
Yeah.
Is it a lav mic or it's the mic from your headphone?
These are Bluetooth, but I find the sound is better if I actually plug in the.
Yeah, it's really good sound. It's just so I just sort of try to lean a little forward or something so that it's not scratching.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, that really strikes me. It's interesting, like as I'm listening to you talk and I'm thinking about when was the last kind of major uprising in America, and it was in the late 60s. That's just about 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a law professor before I started doing this stuff. And there's this idea also that in American law, there's this every 50 years or so, there's a kind of progressive reset. And then there's during the 50 years, it tends to ratchet in a conservative direction. And then there's some kind of major progressive moment in the law. And I've always thought about how one of the challenges of Jewish law is that it has become such that there isn't that same progressive reset. And so it's become increasingly ratchet and conservative. It tends to be because people are able to leave if they don't like it, and especially in a freer society. So we aren't really getting that progressive reset in Jewish law, and that's part of the challenge that we're facing. So it's so interesting to think about the Jubilee year in that sense, and that actually maybe some genius, God or someone else, had this idea that really it is 50 years, and whether that means once in a lifetime or there's something about 50 years, and that's really built into the very fabric. And I love what you're saying about doing that out of choice rather than waiting for the blood to run in the streets.
It reminds me of of this one small detail that I found pretty meaningful, which is that I've taught a class about kind of the ecology of the Hebrew calendar and kind of the role that spirals play in Jewish tradition, and thinking about Jewish time as a spiral, and thinking about other spiral symbolism in our tradition, one of which is the shofar that we blow on Rosh Hashanah. And what I take from that idea that Jewish time kind of moves in a spiral is that it's always connected, right? There's always a bridge back to the previous. It's a kind of a continuous thread. I've learned, I'm not 100% sure this is accurate, but I've learned that at the Yovel, the practice would be to blow a straight shofar, one that is not a spiral, as a way of kind of, okay, that round of the game is over. Let's start over, so that we can keep playing this game indefinitely. And I like the imagery in that.
Yeah. So can you just talk to us about the farm school? I know this is a little bit of a gear shift. We've been dwelling in very elevated territory, talking about the meaning of Jubilee and of Shemitah, of sabbatical. What was the Jewish farm school, or maybe the right tense is what is the Jewish farm school, or could it be in the future? But how did it start, and what was your role in it?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say for now the was is the appropriate tense. So after college, I went to work at the Teva Learning Center, which at the time was housed up at the Isabella Freedman Jewish Retreat Center in Northwest Connecticut. And Teva is like an environmental ed program for Jewish day schools. An amazing program, and a really transformative kind of experience for the staff who live up there and work together for 4 months. And that was right at the time that this was in 2002, 2003. And in 2003, Adam Berman launched the Adama Fellowship at Isabella Freedman. So that was kind of the first year of that. So through my time up at Freedman, I met kind of a cohort of amazing folks. And we just kind of started scheming a little bit, like, this is amazing what we're doing, and it's like seasonal, not long-term kind of work. How can we kind of capture the energy of this experience and really build a more permanent kind of community around that? So we just started kicking ideas around, and the idea for a Jewish farm-based school started to emerge. There's a school in Vermont called the Mountain School, which does semester programs for high school students, secular, on a working farm, and with a lot of time in the forest as well. So we were thinking kind of modeled after that, either for 11th graders or gap year students or college students. We weren't really sure, but we were young and didn't really know what we were doing. So those conversations eventually kind of led a core group of folks to, in 2005, to just start the organization in a sense. You buy the domain and all of a sudden you're like a real thing. We were being somewhat entrepreneurial, and I was already teaching some classes and workshops for Jewish educators about farm-based education and garden-based education. And so we decided to kind of just start doing that under the banner of Jewish Farm School and kind of see where that led. I'd say for folks who are interested in launching organizations, that's not necessarily the recipe that I would recommend. It kind of led to a very kind of meandering path of trying out different things. And at the same time, like that was exciting, right? Like there was an entrepreneurial element that was exciting about it. So in the first year, we got a small grant from Chazon for $1,800 to run a 4-day seminar for Jewish educators who wanted to integrate farming and gardening into their work. And that was all we did in 2006. And then kind of each year we started to add on other layers. I had moved back to Philly. In 2007, we launched this urban sustainability program. I had worked for 2 years at a public school in West Philly, running a garden program. And that kind of got me connected to the local urban ag and food justice movement. And And so I was really excited about integrating the Jewish community into that movement. In 2008, we started doing alternative break trips for college students on farms around the US. And then in 2009, we started working closely with Eden Village Camp, which had just gotten a $1 million grant to launch as the first Jewish organic farm camp. One of Yoni Stadlin, who is the director of the camp, he and I went to preschool together, and then lost touch for 15 years. And then we reconnected at Isabella Friedman. And he knew that we were, Jewish Farm School was potentially looking for a place to set up shop. And he invited us to partner with Eden Village. And so for 4 years, we were there. We designed and built the 2-acre educational farm, and we ran all the farming programs during camp. And then we kind of ran our own programs before and after in the shoulder season in the spring and the fall. So that was our main focus for many years. And then in 2013, we decided to kind of pivot, make our work in Philadelphia that had been continuing a bit on the back burner, make that the primary focus of our organization. We handed the farm at Eden Village over to Eden Village Camp to run. They were much more established at that point and able to kind of manage that on their own. So we made that transition pretty smoothly. And then from 2013 to 2019, we were really focused on kind of our urban sustainability and food justice work in Philadelphia. And the goal of that was working primarily with young adults, kind of connecting the Jewish community to the local urban farming and food justice movement by supporting the work of urban farms and food justice organizations through volunteering and advocacy. Building the capacity of the Jewish community to live more sustainably through a series of workshops called our shtetl skills workshops, which was kind of, emerged from what we were talking about earlier, this idea that like in the shtetl, there were certain skills that were just common knowledge because of the nature of life in the shtetl. And can we kind of like revive that tradition of doing more stuff with our hands, learning how to be not just consumers in this world, but also producers of some kind. And then kind of connecting all of that work to the cycles of the Hebrew calendar by doing kind of environmentally or garden-based Shabbat and holiday celebrations. So that was our work for 5 or 6 years before we decided to wind down.
Can you put the whole Jewish farming world into some kind of context or some kind of understanding, especially from the position of reflection? Like, what is it all about? Meaning, do we imagine a world in which, meaning, why is it that there's this kind of movement of the saying, Jews should be doing farming? Like, is it kind of really, I'm always trying to sort of sort out in my mind and in terms of what the goals are. Is it, one possibility is that there's a group of Jews who really just loves farming and loves nature, right? And that kind of thing. And the Judaism that we've grown up with is very heady, very much about being inside a building and singing. And we're saying it's not working for a certain niche of the Jews. And actually, that's a shame because we have all of this ancient wisdom and also practices that are very much about what these people actually love. So why are we forcing a square peg into a round hole? And let's actually sort of diversify the different ways of being Jewish. That's possibly number one. Possibly number two is something that goes further than that and says, no, actually, we should be re-emphasizing our farming roots. I think about the founding of Israel in those days. There was there was a reason for that. We have to go and go to a new land, and there's going to be a lot of swamps there, and so we're going to have to actually get it working. So, but why in America in the 21st century, like what is the drive if it's something beyond like just creating a space for the people who really love that? It seems that like, is the world going in that direction, or is there something that maybe by having a small group doing this, it's making Jewish wisdom accessible in a more powerful way that can then sort of metaphorically be translated to other things? Or, I guess I'm interested in just the analysis that says, why is this a really important kind of Jewish work that should be done in the early 21st century?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a lot there to unpack. I mean, I think the general trend within the Jewish community, to especially among kind of folks in their 20s and 30s, to finish college, and instead of necessarily looking for office jobs or other kind of more conventional jobs, were drawn to working the land and getting closer to the sources of their food. I think that maps pretty squarely on that trend in like the country in general, right? I think after several decades of kind of food becoming much more processed, and agriculture becoming more and more industrialized, and food companies becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and kind of the palette of the United States becoming, just more and more commercialized. There was pushback. The organic food movement really started to take root in the 90s, and then kind of, I think the CSA, the community supported agriculture movement, really started to connect folks to local small scale farms, and that people just started to get excited about good food, and then by extension getting excited about kind of working with their hands. I think we found this to be the case, and I think the movement in general finds this to be the case. What you named is that many of the folks who are drawn to the Jewish community farming movement are folks who have not felt particularly at home in other parts of the Jewish community, for a variety of reasons. It could be that it just didn't speak to them. It could be that they didn't feel welcome for one reason or another. And kind of getting out on a farm, working with their hands. Often these programs involve kind of everyone living together communally. There's a lot of like community process and community singing, and kind of internal reflection work, and leadership development. So it becomes this really robust package that I think a lot of young adults really thrive in. And then that spread to other age groups as well. More and more Jewish camps started adopting gardens and farms as part of their programming, schools and synagogues as well. So I think there's, for the last 3 or 4 years, there was this formal field building initiative for the Jewish community farming field that was funded by the Jim Joseph Foundation and UJ Federation and the Leishtag Foundation and Natan and a few other funders as well. And that brought together about 15 different Jewish farming organizations. And we felt like as a movement, we were at this, maybe not a crossroads, but we were at a point where we had been successful in kind of our own small silos, but there was a real need to kind of professionalize the field and amplify its presence in the wider Jewish community. And so through that field building initiative, I think it's been very successful for a lot of the organizations, developing more robust evaluation tools and sharing of curriculum and best practices, and really thinking about kind of the leadership development and gender equity within the movement, all sorts of really important topics. And a report was released in the winter, an external report that looked at, we did a kind of an aggregated survey, and looked at the data from that, and really found that for many of the people who participate in Jewish community farming, it is either the only or one of very few Jewish things that they do. And so I think in this moment, like that's one goal, or that's one role the movement can play. And so if one of the goals is opening the tent to more people, well, then what do you do with them once they get in the tent? And I think that one of the things that the movement is working on now, and I imagine the current situation, both with the pandemic and with the protests that are going on, and the movement for police accountability and to support Black lives, that the Jewish farming organizations, some of them are becoming more politicized and are really thinking not just about this as a good vehicle for Jewish identity building or Jewish education, which is primarily the motivation of the funders.
Yeah.
And actually, no. This is also about environmental sustainability and resilience. This is also about food justice. This is also about working across race and class lines to build a more just and equitable food system, and by extension, society. So that's starting to happen, and I'm curious to see how it emerges. I know it's there's been a bit of a disconnect between kind of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable and the organizations that make up that movement, and like the climate justice and food justice work.
So I'm really excited by what you just said, because what I love about the huge amount of people I meet that are part of like roughly earth-based Jewish organizations. I'm like making up a term to sort of create one umbrella around all of the different farming and connect to the earth kinds of organizations. Jaffe is an umbrella organization that helps to do that. But what so strikes me is that I really don't think, at least today, I think that the vast majority of people are in those spaces not sort of for the sake of, this is sort of an interest of people and we're going to meet those people where they are. Like, no, like we need to fix the world. Like we need to recognize that we are part of the world. You started off this episode, or I think you started off this episode, but in some of your writings or speaking, or I've seen you talk about like Adamah is the earth, Adam is the human being. They're the same root. We're part of the same thing. And I think it's really exciting to recognize that connection. I think it's actually deeply energizing and wonderful. And it doesn't need to be for the purposes of like Jewish engagement, or like that's what young people are interested in. It's like, oh, I spend time in those spaces and I'm surrounded by people who actually have like a deep commitment and passion for the work. Like that's a deeply powerful thing. But I wanted to talk about how that passion manifests and how we talk about it, because when Dan was asking you before about sort of the motivations behind the current Jewish farming movement, and like what I find sometimes, or I would say most of the time, is that when I ask people like, why do Jewish farming work? Some of the answers I get are about how deeply rooted and ancient it is, which is true. It is undeniably true. We can look at our texts, and we've been talking about this already. Like the agricultural nature of Israelite society is the most, it's not even like a thing that the Bible talks about. It's the entire rhythm and structure of the Bible. So it's like almost ridiculous to even try to make that case because it's so clear. But I'll be honest, like I don't find that, like for me personally, I'm not speaking for everybody because I know there are folks who differ from my orientation. Like I don't find that it is a compelling argument to be told like, Lex, you get the chance to jump aboard this really long and historic project that has been around for a long time, that traces back to the Bible. What inspires me more is you get to do something unprecedented. When you say to me, it's not actually clear that Jubilee has ever been celebrated in the way that the Bible describes. That's something you mentioned. That's something scholars look at. That excites the hell out of me. That's like, wow, we could be the ones to do this for the first time ever. What if we made that argument? What if we said, oh, and even Shemitah, like the sabbatical year has never been, the last sabbatical year, I think 6 years ago, was sort of observed in diaspora, but historically, it was assumed to be only an Israel thing. And so we could brand this, I'd hate to talk about it in marketing terms, but like there is some element of that. Like we could talk about this as, wow, we in 2020 get to be the first people to actually embrace what a sabbatical year would mean in diaspora. How exciting would that be? As opposed to we're continuing this long tradition that has been around for thousands of years, which once again, it's true, but like, is it, like, do we sell ourselves short when we assume everything has to be a continuation of the past as opposed to a really exciting new contribution? Like, what are we missing when we only make the side of the arguments that tie ourselves to history?
It's a great question. I I have a dear friend here in Philly who's a Black gay Catholic urban farmer, the descendants of enslaved Africans, who is just his name's Chris Bolden Newsome. He's an amazing teacher and grower of vegetables and just a wonderful person. And he and I have teamed up on a bunch of programs over the years. And one of the things that he said when he was speaking at something is he said, we as a people survived by layering things on top of what was there, not by disregarding the old and replacing it with the new, right? As someone who, he's saying that as someone who is both Catholic and very in touch with kind of his African diaspora story and African roots. And I think the branding question is a good one, and I want to give a shout out to Nigel Savage from Chazon, who Chazon's been at the forefront of some of the work on Shemitah. And one of the first things Nigel said to me about Shemitah is that Shemitah is an amazing concept with terrible marketing, and it feels very abstract. It feels unrealistic, and for a lot of people they tune out. And then there's kind of like the Shemitah nicks of the world that like are all in. And I'm glad to hear, I think you're one of them. But I think that to me, the way that I kind of relate to Judaism in general is that it is an ongoing dynamic process of reaching back to the past to understand the history, understand the concepts, and understand the laws, and maybe more importantly, what are the underlying values that animate those laws, right? And so when I've looked at the Jewish agricultural tradition and the blueprint that it provides us with for society, I say, okay, what are the underlying values there? And then how do we take those values and bring them to bear on contemporary issues and in our contemporary context? So the practices might look different, but we know what those practices are, and the values are manifesting in a contemporary context. And I think in a way like that, I mean, that's been the project of Judaism for so long, is like constantly kind of like adapting. A friend of mine calls it the great wiggling. We're like constantly wiggling and adapting to survive, whatever that looks like. We're changing the way we dress, we're changing the words that we say, we're changing various practices and norms within our communities, so that we can be adaptable and flexible and navigate winds of change and come out on the other side, right? What doesn't bend breaks, in the great words of Ani DeFranco. And so I think that when it comes to something like Shemitah or Yovel, I mean, you should know there's like a 8-person email thread in my inbox right now about that exact topic, where I guess the person who initiated it, Risa Cooper from Shoresh in Toronto, it's another Jewish farm up there. I think she's studying Daf Yomi, the daily day of page of Talmud, and she just uncovered the section of Shabbat that says, if you're wandering and you lose track of the days of the week, like, when do you celebrate Shabbat? And there's one opinion that is you start counting from then, and when you get to the 7th day, that's Shabbat. And there's another opinion that is like, no, that next day is Shabbat. And she says, why don't we just do the same thing with Yovel? If we don't know when it is, why don't we just claim it? Either it's next year, it's like after the next Shemitah year, or, you know, we'll start now and it'll be after 7 cycles. So, you know, there's like an interesting thread there. I've also heard that according to Jewish law, Yovel only applies when the majority of Jews are living in the land of Israel, which has not been the case. But we're like we're getting closer to that. And so once that happens, that will actually trigger a halachic, a Jewish legal necessity to figure it out. And I don't know what that'll look like, if it'll just be a continuation of kind of the loopholes that allow us to work around it, or if there would actually be like a deep reckoning and visioning of what that could look like. And I think that, look, I got turned on to Shemitah, like, I think in a class I took in college. So this is almost 20 years ago. And there's been a few Shemitah years since then. And each year I've seen the buzz in the Jewish community, especially in the diaspora, like grow and grow and grow around this. And at the same time, and one of the most important messages that myself and folks at Chazon and Yigal Deutscher, who has been a leader in this work as well, he wrote something called the Shemitah Manifesto, and is that you have to be planning for it all 6 years. And then sure enough, it's just inevitable that like you finish the Shemitah year and you're in year 1, 2, or 3 of the cycle and no one really cares. And then all of a sudden in 6 months before Shemitah, everyone's like, oh, let's do some Shemitah programming. Let's start thinking about this now. So I think with Yovel, the Jubilee, if that's coming every 50 years, it's even more of a challenge to kind of have that be an anchor that around which we orient the community. But I think that like, I think to your question of like, do we lose something when we feel like we need to be continuing some ancient legacy as opposed to creating something new? I mean, that really speaks to different communities within the wider Jewish community and how people relate to Jewish law, the Torah, etc. I think there's a lot of people who are doing just that, who are reinventing, reimagining all sorts of Jewish liturgy, Jewish ritual, Jewish practices, Jewish law for this moment. And there's people who do feel more connected to and maybe in some way beholden to the traditions of the past. So what I found in our work is like, it depends who the person is who's showing up. We have people who they showed up because they were looking for something meaningful and Jewish, and they didn't feel like they were getting that anywhere else. We also had people who are like deeply involved in the Jewish community and deeply observant. And for them, what's more interesting is to learn how modern environmental ethics relate to ancient Jewish ethics. That's more of a motivation for them. So I think it just depends a little bit on who's in the room and where they're coming from.
Lexa, I want to pick up one of the ideas that you brought up when we have our debrief in a few weeks, because I love this idea that we've never observed these things before, but I think in a slightly different way. Like I'm imagining that whoever wrote these ideas down, whoever, kind of assuming on the assumption that we never actually observed them before, did it because they said, oh, we should have observed. I mean, this would have been great, and because we didn't do this, we had these problems, and now it's too late. We've been exiled from the land, or whatever the reason is. And they're kind of saying, like, if you're ever in a position again to be in the situation that we were in, you should do these things. Like, this is our idea. And that doesn't mean that it has to be right, but it means that at least we should consider that somebody may have thought of that immediately after the disaster. And I'm kind of thinking about like what we would write right now. And I'm bringing this around full circle, Nati, to where we started. And this idea that, we in theory, we have these experiences throughout Jewish history, and then we experience some kind of disruption and we say, ugh, I wish that we had the manual. First of all, we probably did have the manual, but the question is on the assumption that we didn't realize that we had the manual. In a way, the question is like, what would we want to hand down to our descendants to say, look, next time a virus comes, a pandemic, here's what you should do. Maybe our ancestors were a little too subtle in putting these in these kind of imagined historical circumstances, and it didn't quite work. Maybe there's a better way. But I want to ask you about the Jewish farming, and then also the question that we opened with on the level of related to this. It's just that as I've been listening to all this, and particularly you brought up the person who was studying the daily Talmud page, I'm thinking that as long as there are all these different people engaged in various elements of the Jewish heritage, somebody is there potentially to know something that's needed when the time comes and that knowledge is needed. If nobody's doing Jewish farming, then we never have either the knowledge about farming or the metaphorical analogs, the idea, hey, I think this is kind of like that. If nobody's studying Talmud, then we never have that idea that, hey, maybe we have the ability to just declare this thing that we really need right now. You know, if people are engaged in serious ways with all of this stuff, even though it's not necessarily, it doesn't seem necessarily that it's the most pressing for our day. In the case of farming, I don't think that's actually accurate. I think it may well be, but it's interesting that it seems almost like nobody has to argue about why we should be funding, you know, yeshivas where people are going to be studying the Talmudic stories about the temple, which are completely not relevant to our day. But people, I think, have a sense that, oh, well, there's something there that maybe, you know, will become relevant at some point. And of course, people should be engaged in that. And yet there doesn't necessarily seem to be that same attitude towards other elements of Judaism that may seem like they're, you know, not necessarily the most relevant in urban America, like farming. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of reflect on that, both in terms of whether there really are things that are known. Like it's something that I heard you talk about was this idea, right, that from farming, you get the idea, and we talked about this a little bit before, that you need to be storing things up. And that also creates economic power, and not necessarily in a good way, but that there are all kinds of ways in understanding that when you're a farmer, you understand certain things that maybe someone who's not a farmer doesn't quite understand. And I guess I'm also interested, as we wrap up, in your reflection on what does it mean that maybe the farm school wasn't able to continue as an organization. You know, that even though there's support from the funding world, there's perhaps not enough support. We also think about BIMBOM, which here in our digital age, BIMBOM was a great organization that had to do with using digital technology to teach children about Jewish sources. And a year before the coronavirus hit, the funding world didn't see that it was valuable enough to make sure that it kept it. And I just worry that we're gonna feel that about farming one day. And I guess I'm curious if you could just sort of reflect on the arc of your experience with the farm school.
Sure. So I'll take the first part of that question first, and I want to kind of reflect on or share kind of what you know, you run an organization called the Jewish Farm School, and the first question most people get, you run an organization like the Jewish Farm School, and the most common question is like, huh? Or like, what's Jewish farming? Like, what does that even mean, right? And so over the years, learning more about these practices, and again, trying to distill out these underlying values. I mean, one of the things that struck me right away in learning about this was that the first time farming appears in our text, it's a curse, it's a punishment, right? Adam and Eve are in the garden as tenders, in what's kind of described as more of like a stewardship model. And when they eat from the one tree they were forbidden from eating from, which I love, Rabbi Arthur Waskow here in Philadelphia has this beautiful way of describing that. They're put in this garden full of abundance, and they're told to show just the slightest bit of restraint, right? There's so much for you to eat here, just one tree, let that one be. And like 20 minutes later, they're eating from that tree, right? And so the consequence, the punishment, the consequence, however you want to think of it, is that they leave the garden, and they have to, you know, by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. You're going to become farmers. So farming is not really thought of in the most sympathetic terms in our tradition. And the way that I've kind of understood that is exactly what you mentioned. What farming allows us to do as a society is create wealth, is create a surplus, grow more than we need right now. Well, then the question is, well, who controls that surplus, right? And we see this very vividly in the story of Joseph, when he predicts the 7 years of plenty followed by the 7 years of famine. And he tells the Pharaoh, like, let's enact a tax and let's take in the surplus, and then we will control that surplus, and we will use that as a form of control over people, right? We consolidate all of the power. So the Jewish agricultural blueprint, in my mind, is part of this tradition of wiggling. It's saying, okay, maybe our ancestors in the Garden of Eden, pre-agricultural ancestors, were not farmers. The early figures in the Torah are shepherds, right, who are part of an agricultural society, but themselves are not farmers and have kind of a different set of values. But when the Israelites enter the land of Israel, we're going to become farmers, but we're going to do it in a way that kind of preemptively addresses the injustices that are embedded in an agricultural society, right? So first and foremost, I think even that idea is hard to wrap our heads around right now, where there's like a whole resurgence of young people interested in farming, and there's maybe a bit of nostalgia, a bit of idealization of what that looks like. Actually, what our tradition says is like, farming is not the ideal. The ideal is Shabbat. The ideal is Shemitah. That's what we should be working towards. But for 6 days of the week, we're going to toil. For 6 years out of 7, we're going to engage in farming, right? So first we have to look at, well, what are the dangers of an agricultural society? And like I mentioned before, I think it's about power being consolidated in the hands of a few, power and wealth being consolidated in the hands of a few, while many people suffer. So our laws are meant to address those issues preemptively and peacefully. And so kind of lost my thought there. But so I think once we understand that idea, and then we can start to think about Jewish farming as something more than like an engagement activity or a vehicle for Jewish education, but actually it can be a mechanism to address some of the issues that we as a society are facing. There are so many Jewish funders that fund emergency food programs, yet they won't look at Jewish farming programs as, they don't see the potential for Jewish farming programs to play a role in their food security work, right? There's like a disconnect there. And I think hopefully that is starting to change. And funders are starting to see, actually we worked closely with Klein Life, which is like an old JCC in Philadelphia that has a huge kosher Meals on Wheels program. And they started a small garden to contribute to that. And we worked with them to really ramp up their agricultural capacity over a few years. So they are actually now getting support from the local federation that sees the connections between farming and gardening and this food security program. And I think when we can kind of like look a little bit more holistically and structurally, what are the root causes of poverty, of hunger in this country? And what are the ways that we can engage the Jewish community, not just in donating money to those causes, but to be more actively engaged? And it's interesting to note, like here in Philadelphia, there's a disproportionate number of Jews that are involved in the urban farming and food justice movement. They're not necessarily seeing that work as Jewish, beyond maybe some sense of tikkun olam, of repairing the world. But it was very interesting for me to notice that early on. And so to kind of connect those dots, I think allows the work to become more crucial and seen as more important in the eyes of the funders. But at the same time, like, yes, there are trends. And, I'm friends with Sarah Lefton, who ran Bim Bam. And when we decided to wind down, she was one of the first people I closed, she was one of the first people I called. And I hadn't thought about the fact that if Bim Bam was still operating now in this moment, they would probably be getting a ton of support because the moment has changed. And it's unfortunate that that's how the funding world works to some extent. One of the fixes that I've seen for progressive funders is start making 10-year grants, not 2-year or 3-year grants, right? Give these organizations a lifeline and the ability to look off in the distance and not always be scrambling for, just to cover payroll or to close your budget in 6 months. As far as our sunsetting process for Jewish Farm School, I mean, look, we were a pretty small organization. Last year, our operating budget was about $200,000. For the last several years, we weren't really able to turn a corner in terms of funding. It was, for the last several years, our team has primarily been me and kind of an array of folks who are going through different fellowships, the Jaffe Fellowship, a Jewish Environmental Fellowship, the Repair the World Fellowship. So, having staff that are there for 9 months or 12 months and then leave, and then a new person who comes on for 12 months is not a very efficient way of running an organization. And so some of it was like I was kind of ready to move on to the next stage, and as a small organization without a huge without really any reserves, we weren't really in a place to bring on someone new and try to keep it going. And one of the things that my work has really kind of embedded within me over the last 15 years is thinking in agricultural metaphor. And one of the first things that I thought about was that in ecosystems, there are often things called pioneer species. These are like the first species that set up after disturbance, right? So a forest gets clear cut, and the first plants to start growing are the pioneer species. And what happens with pioneer species is that they are able to thrive in those disturbed conditions, and then they actually help make the conditions better so that other species can set up, establish themselves, and then outcompete the pioneer species. And I don't want to take too much credit for the growth of the Jewish farming movement, but Jewish Farm School was one of the early organizations. Our programs, especially our alternative breaks, which were just 1 week long for college students, so many of those, we had a few hundred participants over the years, went on to do other Jewish farming programs or even launch their own Jewish farm or environmental initiatives. And the landscape has grown and become a lot more robust. And our approach of being very nimble and entrepreneurial maybe also left us a bit vulnerable. So, I decided a little over a year ago that I was ready to move on, and worked with our board on creating a bit of a game plan. And again, looking to nature as the model, nothing in nature dies, right? It decomposes. And the nutrients within that organism get recycled through the ecosystem. And so my thought was, what would be an effective and meaningful way to wind down? Are there ways we can essentially kind of like release our nutrients, release our seeds into the ecosystem? And so, from a funding perspective, this was really fascinating. We needed to raise about $60,000 to kind of go through this process that I was imagining. And I reached out to funders that we had relationships with, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. They said, this is really wonderful that you want to close with intention, that you want to close in a way that helps seed new projects in the field. Yes, we'll support this. We'll work outside of our normal funding parameters. We'll kind of make this possible. So a lot of credit goes to the funders for seeing the potential in that moment. Our board chair said to me, we should shut down more often. It's a great fundraising strategy. And so that's what we were able to do. I was able to spend the last 6 months of my time basically compiling a lot of our unpublished curriculum, and putting it together, not just curriculum, but also other types of tools and resources, budget templates and evaluation tools and things like that, and creating a pretty robust package of tools and resources for new and emerging Jewish farm and garden projects. And we released that all using Creative Commons license. So it's all free and available. And hopefully that will be a valuable tool for people in the field.
Closing with the word field, that is, of course, another environmental metaphor. Nice. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And to close out, for all you watching live, thanks for coming. For all of you listening in the future, for me, the future, your present, thanks for listening. We're going to close out by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our 2 Facebook pages. That's jewishLIVE, all one word, or Judaism Unbound. There are our websites, jewishlive.org and judaismunbound.com. There's our Twitter handle, just one of those, at Judaism Unbound. And what did I miss? And you can contact us via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we do appreciate any amount of support you can send our way. If it's just a one-time donation or a 10-year grant, like Nancy talked about, either is deeply appreciated, and you can do that at jewishlive.org/donate or judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound Live.